Greetings to you and welcome to this episode of Grace Podcast. I'm Timothy Muse. I'll be your host as we spend this time together today. It's a joy to be with you. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank you for making this podcast a part of your journey. And I want to thank you for being on the journey. I want to celebrate you being on the journey of bettering yourself, of finding those places and areas in your life that need some attention, some growth, some process. Good for you for being here. Good for you for taking this step. Good for you for asking the questions, even if you're not engaging in the process yet, even if you're just asking the questions, doing the examination. That's awesome. Self-awareness is so important when it comes to personal growth and advancement in our own lives. When we're willing to take that deep dive, to look inside of ourselves and find those places that need some attention, when we're willing to do that, that is a huge step in the process forward. That is a huge step to say that I'm looking into those places and I want to be better for myself, for my family, for my work, for my culture, for my community, for the world. So good for you for being here. And thank you for allowing me to come alongside you. It's truly a joy to be able to offer something, to be able to give something as a process for this. So thank you for allowing me to do that. If this podcast is helpful, please share it out there. Put it out there in your social media feeds. I post on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. If you follow me or any of the life coaching on any one of those feeds, you're going to see these episodes. Share them. Tag me in it. Love to see where you're at. If you're on one of the listening platforms, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or Amazon Music, then follow us, give us a rating and review. Every positive rating and review tells the platform people are listening, and you'll get notifications when a new episode comes out. And if you want to reach out to me directly, GraceLifeCoaching.com. That's where you can get a hold of me, GraceLifeCoaching.com. I'd love to come alongside you. If you've got some questions, want to do some coaching, some Reiki, some meditation, I'd love to help out. However I can. GraceLifeCoaching.com is the website. Today I want to talk about limits. Knowing your limits. Are you done or are you just uncomfortable? We hear it all the time. Know your limits. And that sounds like really good advice, and it is. But there's a problem. Sometimes we say I've reached my limit when what we really mean is it's getting difficult. I'm uncomfortable. I'm tired. I'm frustrated. I'm afraid I might fail. I'm not sure I can do this. Those things are real, but they aren't necessarily limits. And then there's the opposite problem. Sometimes we keep pushing long after our body, our mind, our relationships, or emotional reserve is telling us enough. We can convince ourselves that stopping means weakness. We can tell ourselves, just push harder, don't quit. Other people can handle this. I should be able to do more. And eventually something breaks. So today we're going to explore an important question. How do you know when you've truly reached your limit? And how do you know when you've simply stopped too soon? Because wisdom isn't always pushing harder, and wisdom isn't always stopping. Wisdom is learning the difference. There's a strange message in our culture that says we shouldn't have limits. We hear phrases like anything is possible, never quit, push harder, push through, sleep when you're dead, go big or go home. These phrases can be motivating, of course, but taken too far, they can also be destructive because every human being has limits. We have physical limits, we have emotional limits, we have financial limits, relational limits, limits on our time, limits on our energy, limits on our attention, limits on how much stress we can carry. Limits aren't evidence that something is wrong with us. They're part of being a human. Imagine driving a car and noticing the fuel gauge approaching empty. You don't become angry at the car. You wouldn't say, come on, you should be able to keep going. The gauge isn't criticizing you, it's giving you information. And many of the limits we experience in life work the same way. Fatigue, frustration, resentment, anxiety, loss of concentration, physical discomfort. Those are all pieces of information that we are given. The important question becomes, what is that information telling me? Because sometimes it says you need to stop. Sometimes it says you're growing. Those are very different messages. Think about the last time you tried something difficult. Maybe you started exercising, or maybe you started changing your diet, or maybe you started a business. Maybe you went back to school, or you started therapy, or you began repairing a relationship, or maybe you decided to learn something completely new. At first there was probably excitement. It's like, woohoo, this is awesome. Let's try this. Then came the difficult part. The novelty wore off. Progress slowed, and suddenly you started thinking, I don't know if I can do this. That's where many people stop. Not because they've reached their limit, but because they've reached their discomfort threshold. There's a difference. A limit says continuing like this is going to cause harm. Discomfort says continuing like this requires growth. And growth is rarely comfortable. Consider physical exercise. You begin walking or running. Eventually, your breath becomes heavier. Your muscles become tired. Your brain says, that's enough. But often your body still has capacity remaining. You haven't reached your physical limit. You've reached the place where effort becomes noticeable. Life works this way too. We often underestimate ourselves because the brain naturally prefers what is familiar. The moment something becomes difficult, uncertainty enters. And uncertainty often produces fear. Then fear whispers, maybe you should stop. But before you stop, ask yourself, am I actually unable to continue, or am I simply uncomfortable continuing? That's a powerful question, because oftentimes we stop too soon. Now, there's several reasons why we stop before reaching our actual limits. One of them is fear of failure. If I stop voluntarily, I never have to discover whether I would have failed. I mean, think about that. Sometimes quitting protects our ego. We can tell ourselves, I could have done it if I really wanted to. But if we keep going and fail, then we have to confront disappointment. So sometimes stopping feels safer. Stopping feels safer because that fear of failure, we don't reach that failure threshold. Another reason is fear of judgment. What if people think I'm foolish? What if people criticize me? What if nobody supports me? What if they don't understand? Sometimes the limits we're experiencing aren't limits at all. It's someone else's opinion, someone else's thoughts. What if they think about this? What if they think about me like this? So we reach that limit and we stop. We stop out of fear of judgment. Another reason is impatience. We expect progress faster than progress usually happens. We exercise for 2 weeks and wonder why our body hasn't transformed. We post online for a month and wonder why our business hasn't exploded. We try something new and become discouraged because we're not immediately good at it. We have confused slow progress with no progress. But progress is never fast. Actually, any progress that's sustainable has to be done slowly. I mean, think about this. You go to bed and you wake up the next morning 50 pounds lighter. Well, now you don't have any clothes that fit. Now you don't have shoes that fit. Progress has to be done slowly. The same would be true. You go to bed and you wake up 50 pounds heavier. Well, you don't have any clothes that fit. Your whole identity has changed. Progress is slow, but impatience gets in the way and says this should happen faster. And so we quit. Another reason is comparison. Someone else seems further ahead, so we think maybe I'm not good enough. But when you compare your chapter 2 to someone else's chapter 18, there is going to be a very different reality. Their progress doesn't determine your capacity. Your capacity is determined by your capacity. So moving away from that comparison, moving away from that propping ourselves up against someone who's been doing it far longer than we have is a very powerful way to be able to expand our capacity and reach for our limits. And finally, sometimes we stop because our old identity is fighting our new direction. You begin changing, and part of you says, this isn't who we are. You started setting boundaries. You started saying no. You started exercising. You started saving money. You started pursuing a dream. You started talking better to yourself and taking yourself seriously. And the familiar version of you wants to return, not because the old version is better, but because the old version is familiar. Growth often feels uncomfortable before it feels natural. And the old version of ourselves will keep fighting to keep us in that old version because it's comfortable. All right? But sometimes you really have reached your limits. There's the other side of the coin. Sometimes we stop before we reach our limits because of fear of failure or judgment, or because of comparison, or because of the old version. And sometimes you really have reached your limits. And it's important for us to look at the other side too, because motivational culture sometimes tells us that stopping is failure, that stopping is always failure, but it isn't. Sometimes stopping is wisdom. Sometimes changing direction is wisdom. Sometimes resting is wisdom. Sometimes saying no is wisdom. Sometimes walking away is wisdom. Sometimes admitting I cannot continue doing this in the same way is one of the healthiest decisions you can make. So how can you tell? One of the most important signs is persistent depletion. There's a difference between being tired after doing something difficult and living in a constant state of exhaustion. Healthy effort usually requires recovery. You work hard, you rest, you recover, you return. But when you're exceeding your limit, recovery becomes harder and harder. You sleep, but still feel exhausted. You take the day off, but don't feel restored. You begin the week already drained. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to that. Persistent depletion. No matter how much you rest, you always feel depleted. Another sign is growing resentment. You used to care about something, now everything surrounding you, it irritates you. All right? Every request feels like an intrusion. Every phone call feels like another burden. Every responsibility feels heavier than it should. Resentment sometimes tells us that boundaries have been ignored. So if there's growing resentment, maybe that's a sign that you've reached your limit. Another sign is deteriorating performance. We often assume more hours create better results. Not necessarily. Eventually, fatigue begins reducing the quality of our work. You make mistakes, you forget things, you lose creativity, you become impatient, you struggle to make simple decisions. Sometimes working less allows you to accomplish more. And if your performance is deteriorating, then maybe you've reached your limits. Another sign is that other important areas of your life are constantly suffering. Maybe your career is thriving, but your family never sees you. Maybe you're constantly helping others, but neglecting yourself. Maybe you're chasing financial success while sacrificing every relationship around you. Success that requires destroying everything else you value isn't really success. Another major sign is you are repeatedly violating your own values. That's worth paying attention to. If achieving a goal requires you to become someone you don't respect, the goal may need to change. Those may be beyond your limits. So as we confront these two things, I've got 4 questions that I think are really important to ask in this, all right, to understand whether you've reached your limit or simply become uncomfortable. Question number 1 is, am I tired or am I depleted? Tiredness can usually be repaired with rest, but depletion feels deeper. If you take a break and your motivation begins to return, you may simply have needed recovery. But if rest doesn't help, something deeper may need to change. Maybe there's a depletion. Maybe you're beyond your limit. Question number 2, is this difficult or is this damaging? Difficult isn't necessarily bad. Learning is difficult. Exercise is difficult. Starting over is difficult. Setting boundaries is difficult. Having an honest conversation is difficult. But damaging is different. If something is constantly damaging you, physically, emotional, relational, financial, your integrity, your sense of self, then pay attention to that, because it's not just difficult, it's damaging. Question number 3, do I want to stop because I can't continue or because I'm afraid of what comes next? That question requires honesty. Sometimes we say, I can't, when we really need to say, I'm scared. And those aren't the same. Fear isn't always a stop sign. Sometimes fear simply means you're approaching something important. And when we approach something important, we can be afraid. So we need to ask, is it true that I can't continue? Or am I dealing with, I'm afraid of what comes next? Question 4, if I rested, adjusted my strategy, and received some help, would I want to continue? This may be the most important question, because sometimes you don't need to quit. You just need to change how you're doing it. Look, the goal isn't the problem. That might not be the case. Imagine you're climbing a mountain. You've been climbing for hours. You're exhausted. Eventually you say, I can't do this anymore. And maybe that's true. But there are several possible responses. You could turn around. You could rest. You could slow down. You could lighten your backpack. You could ask someone for help. You could take another route. You could continue tomorrow. We often think our choices are keep going or quitting, but life usually gives us more choices than that. Sometimes the answer is continue differently. That's an important principle. Maybe you don't need to abandon the goal. Maybe you need to change the strategy. Maybe instead of working 7 days a week, you work 5. Maybe instead of exercising an hour, you exercise for 20 minutes. Maybe instead of trying to solve the entire problem today, you solve the next piece. Maybe instead of doing everything yourself, you ask for help. Maybe instead of demanding perfection, you accept progress. Sometimes we don't reach our limits. We reach the limit of our current strategy, and that's completely different. Because sometimes it's not a limit, it's a strategy, and we need to change our strategy. So I want to give you the 10-minute rule. Here's a practical tool you can look at. When you feel like quitting something worthwhile, give yourself 10 more minutes. Tell yourself, I don't have to finish this. I just have to continue for 10 minutes. Walk 10 more minutes. Write 10 more minutes. Clean 10 more minutes. Study 10 more minutes. Work on the project 10 more minutes. Sit with the difficult task 10 more minutes. Why? Because sometimes the desire to quit comes in waves. And if you immediately obey the feeling, you never discover what exists on the other side of it. After 10 minutes, reevaluate. Ask yourself, am I still capable of continuing safely and productively? If yes, continue. If no, stop. This turns quitting from an emotional reaction into a conscious decision. Another tool you could use is the 80% question. When your brain says, I can't do anymore, ask, am I really at 100%? Or am I at 80% and uncomfortable? You don't need to push yourself to exhaustion. That's not the point. The point is learning that the first feeling of discomfort isn't necessarily your limit. Sometimes you've got 5 more percent, sometimes 10, sometimes 20, and sometimes you've truly got nothing left. The skill is learning to recognize the difference. Okay? The skill is learning to recognize the difference. So another thing that's worth bringing up, and we kind of mentioned this at the beginning, is sometimes we live according to someone else's limits. Sometimes you're told you're too old. You don't have enough education. You're not talented enough. You don't have the right personality. People like us don't do that. You'll never make enough money. That's unrealistic. Maybe you've heard that. Maybe someone else has set limits in your life. And somewhere along the way, that fear became your boundary. Ask yourself, who told me this is my limit? Was it experience? Was it evidence? Or was it someone's opinion? Because other people often project their limitations on us. They aren't necessarily trying to hurt us. Sometimes they genuinely think they're protecting us. But someone else's fear doesn't have to become your future. Someone else's limit for you doesn't have to become your future. All right? And when we're talking about limits, we need to make sure that we talk about recovery as part of the process. We also need to change how we think about rest. And we did a big piece on rest. So I would encourage you to go back and look at that. Rest isn't the opposite of progress. Rest is part of the progress. It's part of understanding our limits. Athletes understand this. Muscles aren't built only during exercise. Recovery matters. The same is true emotionally and mentally. You cannot consistently produce. You cannot consistently give. You cannot consistently solve. You cannot consistently carry. Eventually, you need to recover. And there's an important difference between resting and quitting. Rest says, I still care about where I'm going, but I need time to recover. Quitting says, I no longer intend to pursue this. Don't confuse the two. Sometimes you don't need to abandon your dream. Sometimes you just need a nap. Sometimes you don't need a new career. Sometimes you need a vacation or a day off. Sometimes you don't need to end a relationship. You just need an honest conversation. Sometimes you don't need to abandon the project. You just need help. And sometimes, yes, you really do need to walk away. Wisdom is knowing which one you're facing. Okay? So I would encourage you to create your own limit check. This is something I would encourage you to look at. When you feel overwhelmed, don't immediately say, I can't do this anymore. Instead, stop and ask, what exactly have I reached the limit of? Maybe you've reached the limit of doing everything alone. Maybe you've reached the limit of sleeping 5 hours a night. Maybe you've reached the limit of saying yes to everyone. Maybe you've reached your limit of working without appreciation. Maybe you've reached your limit of carrying responsibilities that belong to someone else. Maybe you've reached your limit of using a strategy that isn't working. Notice something important. None of those necessarily mean your dream is over. They simply mean something needs to change. That's a very different conclusion. Okay? And here's a thing that's really important. Don't make permanent decisions from temporary exhaustion. This is something I want you to remember. Be careful about making permanent decisions during temporary exhaustion. We tend to evaluate our entire lives based on how we feel in a particular moment. A difficult Monday says, I hate my career. A difficult workout says, I'm never going to get healthy. A difficult month says, my business isn't going to work. A difficult conversation says, this relationship is hopeless. Maybe, but maybe not. Give yourself enough distance to evaluate clearly. Sleep, eat, rest, walk, talk with someone you trust, stay away from the situation temporarily, and then ask, do I still feel the same way? If the answer is yes, repeatedly over time, then perhaps change is necessary. But if the feeling disappears after recovery, you probably didn't reach your limit. You just reached your need for rest. Okay? That's an important distinction. So if you've realized that you haven't actually reached your limit, you simply reached discomfort, here are some things you can do to help with that. First, make the goal smaller. Don't run 5 miles, walk 1. Don't write the whole book, write 1 page. Don't change your whole life, change today, right? Simply focus on consistency instead of intensity. Small actions repeated over time beat occasional bursts of hectic effort. We've talked about that. We've talked about that before. Small, consistent actions. Stop negotiating with every emotion. You don't have to feel motivated to act, okay? Some days you simply do what matters because you've decided it matters, even if you don't feel like it. Ask for help. Strength isn't doing everything yourself. Sometimes the strongest sentence you can say is, I need help with this. And remember why you started. When the journey becomes difficult, reconnect with the reason. Why does this matter? What were you hoping to change? Who were you hoping to become? Your reason won't remove the difficulty, but it can give the difficulty meaning. I want to leave you with this thought. There's a place where your comfort ends, and then there's a place where your capacity ends. They are not always the same place. Between them is something important: growth. Your comfort zone may end at one point, but your ability may continue much further. So when you've reached the moment when something inside you says, I'm done, don't immediately push harder and don't immediately quit. Be curious. Ask, am I exhausted? Am I afraid? Am I uncomfortable? Am I being harmed? Do I need rest? Do I need help? Do I need a different strategy? Or have I genuinely reached a boundary that needs to be honored? Perhaps the biggest question is this my limit, or have I simply reached my edge? Because your edge is where growth happens. Your limit is where wisdom tells you to stop, recover, adjust, or change direction. Maturity means learning to respect both. You don't have to prove your strength by running yourself into the ground. But you also don't want fear, discomfort, impatience, or someone else's opinion deciding how far you're capable of going. So, pay attention to the moments when you say, I can't. Add one word. Why? I can't. Why? Maybe the answer will be because I truly need to stop. Honor that. Or perhaps the answer will be because I'm scared, because I'm uncomfortable, because this is harder than I expected, because progress is taking longer than I wanted. And if that's the answer, maybe you're not at your limit. Maybe you're starting at the edge of where the next level of growth is going to come. Rest when you need to rest. Ask for help when you need help. Change direction when wisdom tells you to change direction. But don't mistake discomfort for inability. Sometimes the moment when you most want to stop is simply the moment when you're discovering that your capability is more than you thought. That's what I got for you for today, my friends. I hope it's helpful. If it is, please share it out there. Put it out there in your social media feeds. I post on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. If you're on one of the listening platforms, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or Amazon Music, follow us, give us a rating and review. And if you want to reach out to me directly, GraceLifeCoaching.com is the website. I would love to hear from you because at Grace Life Coaching, we want you to be the best you.